Ikigai has this kind of dual meaning of it being sort of a fulfillment and sort of self-development pursuit. But at the same time, it has this meaning of being a role fulfillment and being in alignment with the expectations of society.
That was Dr. Iza Kavedzija, and this is episode 20 of the Ikigai podcast. Find your Ikigai at ikigaitribe.com. This is Nick Kemp with episode 20 of the Ikigai podcast. My guest in this episode is Dr. Iza Kavedzija. Iza is a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Exeter, an anthropologist of Japan, and the author of Making Meaningful Lives, Tales from an Aging Japan, which was published in 2019. Iza's doctoral research examined the creation of meaning in life, Ikigai, among older people in Osaka, and Iza has also explored narratives of hope and hopelessness in contemporary Japanese society. And in this episode, we'll be discussing Ikigai and happiness of the elderly in Japan. Iza, thank you so much for your time today and for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.
Now, that sounds like a lot of study, Iza. How long have you been studying these fields or themes of Ikigai, meaning in life, aging, happiness, and hope and hopelessness?
I think I started sometime in 2007, 2008, and I remained interested in this for ever since. It started as my doctoral research at the University of Oxford, when I thought I would like to look into different ways in which people conceptualize good life, what it means to lead a good life for them. I'm an anthropologist, and when I started reading a little bit about happiness and the good life, I was a bit surprised at how little there had been written in social sciences, not just in anthropology, about living well, about happiness. And I think there are multiple reasons for this. And of course, social scientists do tend to focus on social problems and injustices, all of which is very much justified and valuable and important. But I do think that just by looking at the inversion of what is a problem, we can't quite find out what is the good for people who we work with. So that is what became my area of interest.
Wow. And that's more than 10 years of focused study. I'd like to start with your life experience in Japan. What first attracted you to Japan?
There are many ways to tell that story, I think. So I first went to Japan when I was a high school student. I'm from Croatia. And in my high school, very unusually, we happened to have a Japanese language teacher, and she managed to organize an exchange program for us. So this was a very interesting opportunity and quite unusual here in this part of the world at the time. So I went to Japan. I spent 3 months there in Sendai. It was a wonderful experience. I had no language ability at that time, really, very basic. And it became an interest of mine. So I started studying Japanese at the university as well, alongside my major in anthropology and sociology. But it always remained sort of a side interest, a passion of mine that I never really thought of as part of my academic pursuit until quite late in the master's year. So when I was doing my master's at Oxford, I decided that maybe focusing on Japan would make sense, since by then I've acquired some language ability and had something of a basic understanding of the history and culture and so forth. So that's one way to say it, to tell that story about kind of the range of decisions and that led to it. There's a different way of telling that story, and that is maybe by even further highlighting the importance of particular people and their ideas, and how that led me to end up in Japan. perhaps some important conversations I had with close friends about what it means to live well, and then realizing that that is quite different in different places and that perhaps people frame it in different ways. So I think that was a beginning for me. But I think this way of framing that story of how something comes about is something I became more attentive as I spent more time with my older Japanese interlocutors in Osaka, who told their life stories quite differently from the way that we tend to. It's like, I decided this, I did that. Their stories always featured the importance of others, always invited and entailed invitations or mentions from friends who then ended up putting them in contact with somebody and very, very explicitly featured other people in it. So I fear there's so many people in this story, it could take quite a long while to tell and do it justice.
I see. Okay, that's all right. I think that would be very interesting. I'll tell the audience, I read an article which they'll be able to access from my website, so I'll link to it. The Good Life in Balance, Insights from Aging Japan. So you spent quite a few years in total in Japan doing research and interviewing the elderly. So how much time in total would you say you spent in Japan specifically doing that?
For the research that you've mentioned, that was my doctoral research. I spent 14 months with the same group of people. So I was lucky enough to find a community cafe in the south of Osaka. So first I thought maybe I would find some older Japanese who live in their own homes, whether with their families or independently. I was very interested in working with older people, but not those who are necessarily in an institutionalized context. So I wanted to work with people in their own sort of homes. And then I realized that, of course, entering homes isn't a simple matter. So I found this fantastic local NGO, and they were kind enough to allow me to volunteer there. So that meant that I've spent over a year coming to the same place almost daily, almost weekly, and established a very close contact over a course of a year with a group of older people who frequented it. And some came there more regularly, and some came, only once a week. And then, of course, I also went to several other places while I was there, and I went to another such NGO in a different part of the city. But this was my sort of core field site. This was really my home when I was in Osaka for that first time in 2008 and 2009. And ever since, whenever I come back to Japan, I always go there. So I think there's been kind of an ongoing relationship for quite a few years now.
Well, yeah, I didn't realize that it was such a long time with the same people. So I imagine they became dear friends, and you became a dear friend to them.
I think, yes. I think there was a sense of closeness. They got quite used to me. There were some nice situations. Obviously, I was rather young at the time, but sometimes they would forget, and they wouldn't really pay attention to that. So if they were sharing some heat packs for lower back pain or something like that, they might offer me some, and then another person would say, "It's okay, she doesn't need it." So it was rather nice. It was a very kind of close relationship. Unfortunately, some of them are no longer here.
Mm. Now, reading your study reminded me of my wife's aunts. She had 6 aunts, and all of them in their late 70s, early 80s. And of course, at Shogatsu, my wife's father was the chonan, so the oldest son. So every Shogatsu they would roll up, and they had this incredible energy, and they were quite fit, and they'd come in bowing, and they'd all sit around the kotatsu, just chatting away like they were best friends. And yeah, it really gave me some insight into, I guess, how happy people could be just talking and sharing stories. And one of them I nicknamed Frodo because she was so small and she had this black curly hair. She really looked like Frodo Baggins from Lord of the Rings. So, but unfortunately, she passed away last year, which was, really sad sort of, you find that out and think, oh, I'll never see my favorite aunt again. And what I found funny too was how the place, the cafe, was described as a salon in Japanese. Is that what they called it in Japanese, a salon, like in katakana Japanese?
Yeah. Saron kissa is, I think, a term for that. So it's like kissa is from kissaten, like a coffee shop. And saron is, I guess it implies that it's more sort of an open space, and it's not not necessarily a place which is operated purely for, for profit.
So yes, I was reading your article again last night, and it made me come to realize how complex happiness or managing happiness is in Japan. And you write, happiness in the Japanese context can usefully be understood as deriving from a series of negotiations and balancing acts between contrastive values and orientations to the world, which really sounds complex. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I was thinking about a way we can make sense of this enormous amount of data that a long stay and long research stay where every day yields a lot of material. How can we make sense of that? And then I was trying to kind of order it. And some themes that emerged very strongly in lives of my older friends. And I had the privilege to listen to conversations as they unfolded spontaneously, or sometimes sort of taking part in those conversations, or throwing in a question and maybe gently steering them, as well as having an opportunity to have sort of structured interviews and life course narratives that I was able to collect from them. So in all these various interactions, themes that emerged quite strongly were themes that related to, say, autonomy or independence and dependence, the kind of striving to do justice to others and look after them, and to pursue those things that matter to the person as well. So to have some degree of privacy, but also have a sense of sociality, to avoid the burden of over closeness, but at the same time have sort of an intimate sphere. And I think it was quite important here for the people that I worked with, because as people move through lives, some of their close friends, or what scholars sometimes called consociates, those that we move through life with, that we've known for a long time, say classmates or neighbors, those people are no longer there. And the older Japanese, like people everywhere, might find themselves in a situation where they need to form new relationships. And so what was important for them then is to try and form relationships that are friendly and warm, but that are not overly, as one might call them, sticky or overly burdensome. I think they spoke of burden quite often. One way of doing that was precisely by coming to this salon or community space. But it was also open to other community members, so it wasn't an exclusively sort of older person space. And in the process of being there, what they needed to attend to was how to be friendly to others, how to be warm, but at the same time, how not to be overly intrusive, ask questions about their lives that might be too much or inappropriate for a group setting, how not to bring other people's mood down. And in all those pursuits, sort of a thought of others and their situation, considering their perspective was quite important. But also making sure that they had a good time was also quite important. So that's just one example of these many balancing acts that they were involved in. Another one that transpired, and that I'll maybe touch upon in a bit more detail later, another sort of dynamic that seemed quite important was between narrative activities of speaking and describing lives and reminiscing together, what you might call a narrative mode, in which you're making sense of a situation, and being able to be in the moment, admiring how a dessert was served, or how a sweet brought by somebody from a remote region that they visited is wrapped. And really just dedicating all the attention to that, being there in that moment, and not necessarily reminiscing or thinking about the future. And that was another sort of balancing act that I think those who were able to live well we're very good at.
Wow, you've just summarized all the probably all the answers to all the questions I had prepared for you. It does sound like a balancing act, and Japanese, they seem to have the social awareness and ability to be skilled in doing it, and it obviously just becomes part of their makeup. But reading your article was hard work for me because I stopped and would reflect, thinking, that's right. I remember Japanese, even just Japanese friends my age, seem to appreciate things differently to how Westerners would. And I had to take a break from reading because it just brought back all these memories. And yeah, the burden part came up in my mind so much that Japanese don't want to overburden themselves, and there's the whole meiwaku thing, which we'll talk about. So I was really impressed with your article, or not your paper. It's quite a long paper, and I thought a lot of research and love has gone into this article, which meant I thought, wow, this person really understands the Japanese people. One thing I'd like to touch on is the word happiness. So generally in English, we just use the word happiness, but in Japanese, there are three ways to say happiness: shiawase, ureshi, and kofuku. Would you like to touch on the differences between those three words of happiness?
Well, so I think the third one, kofuku, that you mentioned, I think is in some ways maybe closest to sort of abstract sense of well-being, and the closest perhaps to how we understand in English how it is used. At the same time, it's quite an abstract word, and you really wouldn't very often hear it in sort of common conversation and everyday conversation. So it's, I think often, you can find it in texts perhaps. At the same time, the two other terms that you mentioned, the shiawase and ureshi, are both very frequently used. And they have some similarities, but they're not entirely interchangeable. The sort of shiawase might be translated as happiness or good fortune or blessing. Ureshi might be translated as glad, pleased, happy. But I think the best kind of illustration would be maybe through examples. Mm-hmm. For instance, one of my older interlocutors explained to me that she joined a sports club after turning 50 and now became, as a consequence of that, a bit more outgoing, a bit more active, less shy. She said, I made many friends and I became more outgoing. Now I'm really happy. Honto ni shiawase. Ureshi for coming. We're so pleased you came. I'm so ureshi that you're here. Or I'm happy that I got to see such and such film. So it's a sort of a frequently used word. It includes a sort of cheerful or glad feeling, I would say. So these are, I think, the most commonly used terms. I think it's also worth mentioning that sort of happiness in that sort of a large evaluative sense, like leading a happy life, is not very frequently used in Japan. It's not something that I heard very often, and people were a little bit reluctant to say that about their own lives.
One example of actually a very old lady in your paper, how she defined happiness or what happiness meant to her, amused me, and I think our listeners will be very surprised. So a kind 90-year-old lady who came to know you well shared with you that in life, if you look after your husband's parents, you will be most happy. I think most, if not all, of my listeners would think the opposite of that statement. I'd like to ask you, what was this old lady really wanting to communicate with this statement?
So I think maybe I need to give you a little bit more context to do her a bit more justice. So this came at the end of her life story, and she gave me her life story over several different sittings. So we spoke for quite a long time. This person, she led a long life. She had many children. She lived through the Second World War. Her house was on fire during the Second World War, and she had to run away with her children in her arms by herself, away from the Kansai region on foot. So she lived through considerable hardship, then lived a sort of a long and content life with her husband and with her children post-war. Her husband was a sort of an official, so they had sort of a stable source of income, and her main feeling of sort of field of self-realization was to care for her family and to make sure that, for instance, that they're eating healthy, and that, she could care for their health and for their well-being by making sure that they eat balanced meals. So the kind of ethics of care at play here. So I think what she was getting at here, perhaps, was the sense of the importance of care and importance of caring for others. And if one cares for others, then everything will be good, and that care will also come back to you in one way or another. And this is not about straightforward reciprocity, of course, but in a sense that if we create a caring world and a caring community, then one way or another, those good things will be there, and therefore they will be there for us, hopefully, should we need them one day. Another way of thinking about what she might have been getting at here is a sort of a sense of fulfilling your social role. So not everyone finds their sense of fulfillment through fulfilling their social role, but she certainly did really well in doing this job. She thought of herself primarily as a wife and a mother, and that was part of this effort. It was a source of fulfillment for her. And I think Ikigai, as I'm sure you touched upon in the previous podcast, particularly with Gordon Matthews, has this kind of dual meaning of it being sort of a fulfillment and sort of self development pursuit, but at the same time it has this meaning of being a role fulfillment and being in alignment with the expectations of society. And I think in this case, what she was trying to get at is that when those two are in alignment, when our own sense of growth and fulfillment are not in tension with those that are expected of us, that can be very positive. We have to think about it in the context of her life and of the generation. And when I spoke to her, this lady was in her 90s. But her sense was that I think that care circulates in this broader way. And so if you look after others, hopefully, the world will be a good place.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for the context. That helps us understand, obviously, what she meant. And I have been told by several Japanese that, yes, finding one's role in their personal community, whether that's their family or maybe in their neighborhood, is a way for them to experience Ikigai, and also this idea of caring for others. But even a young Japanese venture capitalist I interviewed said, he kind of called it the secret hack is understanding a role in society, which involves providing for the people you care about or the people who define who you are. And I think it's a great learning. It's something we should all probably think about. What's our role? How can we help others? Especially the people who define us, whether you're a parent or work role or even in just your community. Moving on with happiness, your interlocutors, which really means your study subjects, they rarely spoke directly of happiness, and that stating such things about oneself could be perceived as bragging. And it is customary in Japan to represent oneself and one's associates in a modest, self-deprecatory manner. When I read that, I found that to be so true. you seldom see Japanese as individuals celebrate or ecstatically express happiness. And it's something my wife doesn't do either. Where I have the tendency to want to share and celebrate good news or personal achievements. In your time in Japan, did you ever witness any of your Japanese friends express joy without restraint, like freely and gleefully?
I would say yes. I would say absolutely. But I think maybe may have been directed slightly differently. So rather than being ecstatic at one's own achievement, I would very frequently see quite unbridled joy at someone witnessing a beauty of colorful autumn foliage on a mountainside, or child blowing bubbles. There's this sense of a kind of a gift of something you are able to take part in, and I'd say that kind of joy was certainly there and ever present. People really appreciated things that they saw or read or witnessed. The kind of happiness statements that that maybe we might be looking for in one's own achievements. I think that they would be probably a little bit less frequent.
Yes. We'll touch on how Japanese do appreciate the smaller things in life far more than perhaps we do in the West. And they do seem to, really find joy and express it. Their face will light up when they just observe something. So I agree with you. It's something they observe and share rather than celebrating or expressing their good news about a personal achievement. You also noted that your study subjects frequently spoke of the sense of freedom they enjoyed in their later years and the enjoyment of their hobbies and the importance of self-cultivation. And these are themes of research pioneer Kamiya Miyako, which she writes about in her seminal book, Ikigai ni Tsuite. So more than happiness, is Ikigai more important to the elderly, you think? Or is it just something that seems to naturally occur because they're at an age where they're free, they're no longer working, they're no longer raising children? Or is it something they actively seek?
This is a difficult and a very interesting question. Thank you. I think it's one of the best ones that I got about this work. It's really interesting. So I think I don't think the Japanese people and the people I had a privilege to work with really spoke very much about either. And I don't think they really spoke about Ikigai or about happiness very much, because both of these are seen somehow as practical, as based in doing, in processes, as ongoing, rather than something that's easy to capture. So to the extent that, in the sort of public discourse, Ikigai was very strongly associated with older people. As part of my background research for this work, I looked at academic works and sort of self-help books and literature and newspaper articles in a particular period of time, looking for different uses of the word Ikigai. And what transpired is that Ikigai was very frequently associated with older people in these various sort of popular works, and or with other groups that were somehow seen as being at threat of losing it or not having it. So Ikigai, I think we have to say here, is in sort of a basic sense, it means having something that makes life worth living, something that gives you sort of a motivation to live. And in this sense, I think people who are perceived to be a threat might be particularly those who are about to retire. So if you were finding, your structure, your will to live, your motivation, your social role, your sense of fulfillment in your job for many, many years, but also this job may have been quite all-encompassing, working long hours, which did not necessarily leave much space to create ties in the community and have a rich social life outside the company. Once one retires, it might be a little bit difficult then, and one might feel a sense of loss. And so I think there was this sense that for those people who are finding themselves in this situation, Ikigai then becomes a problem. So in that sense, in the public discourse, Ikigai is, and particularly at that time where there was sort of an Ikigai boom in literature, is this understanding that Ikigai really only comes to the fore when it is a little bit of an issue. And otherwise, it sort of slips into the background, and it's just something that people, to the extent that we're feeling like we're living, we do tend to have some sort of thing that pushes us along. And this doesn't have to be a grand thing. This doesn't have to be something huge. There are, just things that get us out of bed in the morning. There'll be multiple things. But when I try talking to my older friends and in the research participants in my work with about Ikigai, often they really didn't want to talk about it. They didn't really feel like they had anything particular to say. That at this point, especially kind of for older people, I said, well, at this point it is about just finding enjoyable things. Tanoshi, finding something that's fun and something that's tanoshi that will kind of enrich your life as well. So in that sense, we could say that was quite important and seen as quite important. In this sense, also there is a little bit of a duty to take up hobbies, to grow, to continue to pursue something. They sort of pursuing things in order to kind of achieve some progress in self-development. And self-development here isn't seen as a selfish thing, isn't seen as something that, is very much self-oriented. It's almost seen as a duty to the extent that if we are looking after ourselves, if we are feeling well, if we are doing things that are worthwhile, then we're not going to be, burden on others. And that is then, of course, particularly important for elders. So it's important. The elders see it quite as important to pursue their Ikigai a little bit more actively because they want to avoid becoming a burden. And so you would find that a city hall would organize Ikigai school, but really what Ikigai school was just a range of various social groups where one can either pursue traditional arts or theater or get together to reminisce about the past or have a sports group to do a little bit of exercise together. And we can see that even though it is presented as self-development, it is always social. So it's always about kind of joining in and doing things with others as well in this sort of usage. But in sort of an everyday use, I think it was more about kind of finding something that will move you along, that will make your life livable.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a contrast to the misinterpretation to the West. And it's interesting how you point out perhaps when they do talk about it or consider it, it sort of suggests they don't have an Ikigai at that time, hence maybe the need to think or discuss it. But I do like this idea. It can be a spectrum of just small things, personal things. And in the West, when we think about self-cultivation, there's this tendency for it to be, I'm going to be the best version of myself and rah, rah, rah. Whereas in Japan, it can be the pursuit of a creative hobby. And it doesn't have to be about achieving anything. It's more just pursuing something. And something you touch on in the paper is this idea of doing things properly. And that for some Japanese, their hobbies become more than hobbies. They become a practice. And it was important for them to not be sloppy and do them chanto suru. And I was also wondering if it gets to the point of kodawari, where they take extreme care of the fine details of their hobby, be it flower arranging or painting or calligraphy.
I think this is a very, very important point. Thank you for bringing that up. I actually think that not only is that important in hobbies, because of course among older Japanese, maybe you will find some people who no longer wish to find a new hobby as well. Or they might be continuing with their hobbies. But this is a sort of an attitude to life. Doing things properly could be seen as a sort of attention to form. So whatever you do, you attend to how you do it. And that to newcomers to Japan might seem rather oppressive as well. So when I started working in the community salon, I was very quickly instructed with great attention and care at how to serve a cup of coffee or how to serve a cup of tea and at what angle the teaspoon needs to be on the plate. And that may seem overwhelming at first. It may seem difficult, but it is a form of mastery. And so as you become better at it, the better you become at it, the more second nature it is. And of course, the easier it gets and more enjoyment one can get out of it. Anything you're doing well, you can kind of get a sense of enjoyment from it. So there's this sense that in every sphere of life, one can do things properly. One can water the flowers properly. One can put out the rubbish properly. And as I'm sure anyone who's been to Japan will realize that there are, 17 types of rubbish, depending on, or which area, which municipality you are in. But the sorting of the rubbish is a complicated process. But doing it properly, it gives you a sense of getting things done well. And there's something really interesting about how this then plays out, in that if you are doing something masterfully, really well, whether that be a complex activity such as calligraphy, or whether it be something very mundane, you really have to attend to what you're doing. And in doing that, I think one really has very little space to, say, be concerned or think about worries about the future. And that really offers some respite. And for older people that I worked with, this was an important part of living well, because it allowed them this space to be in the moment as well, be engrossed in what they're doing, and it offers a space of kind of calm and peace and appreciation and sort of aesthetic appreciation of the world as well. So that then is brought back into balance with other sort of sense-making activities, where we kind of do piece together our life as a whole, or try and make sense of it as a whole. But I think this was an important sort of counterbalance to that.
It's something that's always been on my mind is how the Japanese can be present for extended periods of time in their work, regardless of age, really. And they're not, there's no mindfulness boom or anything like that. When they work, they work. And I love going to Japan because when you get served, you get served. So whether you're in a convenience store or at a restaurant, they do appear to take pride in their work, or they just do things properly with care. And it's horrible when I come back to Australia because I go to the local supermarket and, you go to be served and staff are talking and, they're talking to each other as they're serving you and you're almost not there. Whereas I've had countless of experiences in Japan where I've asked someone for directions and they'll take me to the place rather than just give me directions. And when I've taken friends to Japan, they are astounded at the level of service and care. So yeah, Japanese do have this ability to be present in the moment, and they can be in the moment for quite a long time. So I guess that comes natural to them as they get older, when they do perhaps have, far more free time to pursue a new hobby or finally do something once they've retired or stopped raising children. But it was interesting how you said for some of them, when they do leave work, it's almost they've lost that ikigai, and then they have to find another one. I mean, there's so much we could talk about on this subject, and I do have a lot of notes. I wanted to go back to this word meiwaku, which is related to this idea of being a burden. And it's something it's taken me a long time to appreciate this word. I have this one memory. My son was born in Japan, and he spent 1 year at the Hoikuen, or I can't remember the first year of their schooling. And I used to walk him to school, and it was quite hard to say goodbye to him because it was so gorgeous and cute, and I'd be holding hands between the fence, or I'd be hugging him. And so I'm saying goodbye to him one day, and then there was a father next to me looking down at his daughter, and he was sort of smoking a cigarette, and he's like, "Meiwaku kakenai de ne?" Like to his daughter, like, don't cause trouble today. I guess is how you would translate it. But I think in a way he was sort of expressing the same thing I was, but very, very differently. But I just couldn't believe you would say that to your gorgeous little daughter. Don't cause trouble today. So this word meiwaku is really interesting, and it is something Japanese are very concerned about, whether or not they're causing trouble to others. So in the context of your study group, who were elderly, how did this play out in their relationships?
That's a really good question. And I think in so many ways, this sense that one doesn't want to cause trouble for others, doesn't want to be a burden, futan, was ever present, really. I think, in a sense, in order to not be a burden on one's children, for instance, which I think was a very, very widespread concern, they cultivated numerous ties and links. And in fact, we do tend to, in the public discourse, in the media, we tend to think of older age as time when older people really, require care. They're kind of more recipients of care. But I think that something that was very, very noticeable is the amount of care that was present from the side of these older people. Sometimes some of the oldest older people, in a way that they're trying to look out for others, trying to keep track of who is where, whether, they've not seen someone for several days, and then maybe trying to find someone who they could then ask if they could go and check upon them. All the things that they might not be able to do. But all these things, if you wish, emotional labor, they are a form of care. Just because they couldn't do something physically didn't mean that they didn't try and find a way for it to get done. Mm-hmm. And to take away that burden of thinking from others. So I think in that sense, the caring relationships really were ever present in everyday life. And, they would try and find ways to help others and find appropriate kinds of information. Keep in mind that, I remember this person was looking for socks. I saw some good socks on sale. Keeping other people's lives in mind, taking their point of view was important. So in that sense, of course, we have to recognize what you were talking about, the service and being amazing. I think we also have to recognize that this is an incredible, that sort of attention to not being a burden or to doing things well for others. That is also a form of effort and form of care. And so I think that was very, very noticeable among my older friends that were really, really trying to distribute that. So instead of thinking about themselves as independent so much or autonomous, they certainly were trying to cultivate multiple ties and multiple relationships, a form of interdependence with many people, rather than becoming overly dependent on one person or one source of support or help, which would then be a burden. And another thing I think that was kind of interesting in this, in the context of sort of meiwaku, not causing trouble, is I was reminded we were talking about, attending to things and doing things properly becomes their second nature. I think this precisely because, as you described, from very, very early age, it's socialized to pay attention to how it would be for the other person, what that might mean for the other person, and what burden that might impose on them. So I think these two things are very much related. And I think it also goes to show that these kind of balancing acts that are required to live well, on one hand, they seem to kind of entail things that are, to an extent, in tension, but they're also about things that cannot exist one without another. There really isn't any autonomy or independence without dependence. It is all about interdependence. So in that sense, trying to understand that the polar opposites aren't just these independent entities, that they're all kind of ends of the spectrum that are mutually implied and mutually constitutive of one another. And I think that is really the dynamic of meiwaku and avoiding it, and omoiyari, trying to think of others. They are very, very closely related to one another.
It must have been amazing and fascinating to spend over a year? It was more than a year with these group of what I imagine were lovely people, and learning, perhaps even experience what you had maybe read or had learnt about, but actually seeing it in action daily. And yeah, Japanese do seem to always be thinking of others. And it's not always this idea of meiwaku, am I causing trouble? They also are very thoughtful and think of others and almost anticipate what someone might need, or they are reminded of a problem this person has. And as you sort of mentioned, they might go out and get some socks because they heard in a conversation, oh, all my socks have holes in them or something. And so it's a theme. You have all these themes in this paper of, for example, intimacy and independence, which again highlights these themes of balancing opposing ideas, but they're also connected. And I've got so many questions. It could be a very long podcast, but in your paper, you highlight a tension between intimacy and dependence on others for various kinds of support, including emotional, and then maintaining a degree of autonomy and a sense of freedom. And when I read that, that reminded me again of what Kamiya Miyako describes as Ikigai needs, the need for autonomy, the need for a sense of freedom, but also the need for hankyo, which is having, intimate relationships or being accepted by others. And it seems that once retired, Japanese have this desire or even natural tendency to want to explore Ikigai or experience Ikigai Kan, the feeling of Ikigai. So for me, reading your paper, which you don't really mention Ikigai in the paper at all, it highlighted all these elements of Ikigai that I'd been researching. So I think you encapsulated all these themes so well and you laid it out really well. And I think that's why it was, for me, I needed to step away from it because it gave me so much to think about. I had to put it down, thought, I can't read anymore. I've got to, it's like all these thoughts were rushing in my head, like, oh, that's right. That happens in Japan and this is how Japanese behave. And so that article or paper, I'm not sure how to describe it, but How long did it take you to write? I think it would have taken you a long time. It's like a mini thesis or a mini dissertation.
That's a very I'm tempted now. So I've got to say that is sort of an article that came out directly from the conclusion of my doctoral thesis. So it's closely related to the conclusion. And now, if you find that very dense, you might find the book much more easy to read, in that it encapsulates all those themes, but all those themes are elaborated, one in each chapter of the book. So in that sense, I think book gives a lot more examples, it gives a lot more elaboration, and this is sort of all of that work in a nutshell, in a sort of condensed, abbreviated form.
Well, I'll promise to read your book if you promise to come back on.
Fantastic, yes.
But that's a recent book. That was something you only published last year.
Yeah, that's the dynamic of academic publishing.
But it probably took you. How long did it take you to write?
I'm not entirely sure. I think the thesis took several years, and then of course some more changes took a few more years, and it just takes a little while.
And you're working on a new book as well. I believe the title is The Ends of Life, Time and Meaning in Later Years.
That just came out, actually. It's a special issue of Journal of Anthropology and Aging, which is a lovely open access journal. So it means anyone can access those.
But you are working on a book now, aren't you?
I'm working on a book for Cambridge University Press on well-being, actually. So I'm looking at well-being through the lenses of conviviality, or living well together, care, and creativity. Those are that it will be sort of a short book.
And that's not specifically on any culture, or just sort of in general?
Yes, that's right. So it's not drawing solely on my ethnographic examples from Japan, but also on a range of other sources in anthropology. So having realized that there's not a whole lot written in anthropology or social sciences on well-being or on happiness, I also realized that, in fact, it is at the core of many of the things that we work on. And so in order to write about it, I picked several frameworks that I thought are closely related to happiness and well-being, but are sort of theoretical frameworks in their own right. So care, a lot's been written about care. A lot has been written about creativity, for instance, and there's quite a bit written about conviviality, or it means like living well together. And this framework kind of brings together the social, the political, the intimate, the aesthetic. So in a way, I think what it does, it tries to break down these boundaries of different fields in which we study particular topics. So we tend to think of politics as somewhat separate from economics, as somewhat separate from morality, as somewhat separate from aesthetics, and frameworks such as conviviality brings those together. Care, similarly, is integrative. Rather than thinking how these independent individuals then come to form a society and come to live together, by tending to care and realizing that we need care in order to survive from the moment we're born. We really, what is highlighted is this deep relationality of people and the way that we're kind of mutually constituting one another. And so that is something that I also wanted to mention in relation to this work with all the Japanese in Osaka, the importance of others. So for living well for them, one of the things that emerged quite strongly was the sense that, if you listen to a life story from another person, they will highlight the importance of others in those stories. Similarly, whereas they were very reluctant to speak of happiness, or even about being kind of satisfied. Even if you were to ask, how satisfied you are with your life, you'd often get an answer something along the lines, "Oh, quite as far as saying that I'm satisfied." That didn't seem, that's slightly inappropriate, maybe a bit bragging, a bit, but also not in their sphere of interest. But what really often came out from these extended conversations, when people were giving me their life story, often towards the end, they would stop and think for a moment, and after a pause, they would say something along the lines, "I lived a good life and I'm grateful for it." Or if they reflected on some difficulty, they might highlight, how grateful they are for that because of what they've learned, what the challenge precipitated for them. So I think that gratitude is quite important precisely because of this relational quality that it has. It kind of reminds us that we live with others and that we have a lot, that we owe a great debt of gratitude to great many other people. And I think that that puts one in a very different sort of frame of mind. So there's even this form of therapy that I found. I've not been able to. I've not studied it myself, but I've read about it, and it's a very kind of specific endeavor, but it kind of encapsulates something of this gratitude, the centrality of gratitude for well-being, for happiness. The sense that in this Nikon therapy, which Nikon means sort of introspection, people undertake sort of reflections over several days, and Chica Kozala de Silva wrote really beautifully about this practice. She describes how over the course of several days, participants are required to reflect on their lives in relation to three central questions, all of which revolve around the issue of like who do you owe something to, and how much they've done for you, and how much trouble have you caused them, and restructuring your own life story, because stories we tell ourselves sometimes solidify. They sort of stratify themselves into sort of a sedimented form, and if that's a story of suffering, then that may come to define us. So I think it is sense that if you shake up your life story and think of it from a different angle, how much have you received? How much have others done for you? You kind of tend to see a very different part of that life story. So what Oza de Silva describes is this very often very strong response that people had to it. But this is, of course, it's a relatively unusual practice. It's not very widespread. But I've noticed similar sort of tendency in the way that people spoke about their lives, in the way that they're even the language itself compels you to recognize it. It would be almost impossible to say I volunteered in this NGO, in this cafe. In order to be at least basically polite in Japanese, I would have to say I had an opportunity to do so. I was given the chance to do so. Now that very form compels me to consider the importance of others in that, and how interrelated we all are. I think that has a very wide-reaching consequences for well-being and for the kinds of things that you explore in your Ikigai work.
Yeah, I actually had a question for you, but to touch on Nikon, when I engaged with my wife, she was working at a hotel, and as part of a training, she had to go and do like a Nikon, I think it was like a 5-day therapy session. And yeah, outside of the sessions, I wouldn't call them counseling sessions, but the reflective question sessions where they sit down with a total stranger and they basically start off saying, tell me your first memory of your mother. And then they go into tell me what she did for you. Outside of that, they weren't allowed to talk to anyone. So it seemed a very intense sort of process of learning about yourself and understanding what others had done for you. And then it is gaining some popularity, I think. And obviously the third question of what trouble have you caused for others, I think it's going to it would just surprise people, because the first thing they'd want to say is, I'm not causing trouble for anyone. So it's something I recommend our listeners maybe Google Nikon therapy and look at the 3 questions. But one question I wanted to ask you was, did that experience and just living in Japan, did that make you appreciate life and the things in life more? Because I know that it did for me.
Yes, no doubt. In many ways, not just the attention to detail, but certainly this particular attention to others and their involvement in our lives, but also the way that we relate to objects. Making sure. So some of the older people in the salon were. They would sometimes bring things to give to others, and they said, it's good to find an object for home I'm not using anymore. It's better for it to be used and to be looked after and to for it to be had. But also it's good if I give it to someone now and I can see that they're enjoying it, rather than someone inheriting it later and I don't get to see that. In the sense that, objects are important and they need to be looked after. And not just in the sort of Marie Kondo way when you dispose of it, you thank them for your service. But there people certainly do that. It's like you kind of thoughtfully, try and find a thoughtful use for an object or give it to someone who might have use for it. And I think in today's world, sort of the Anthropocene, of the excess of a lot of objects, I think that sort of attitude of considering the uses of things and the kind of good service that they offer us as well gives us a sort of a different attitude to our environment, one that is not purely sort of extractive and consumerist as well. Although, don't get me wrong, I don't want to romanticize the Japanese context. Like, people are as consumerist as anywhere else, and certainly, people have lots of objects and they're not always very careful. But, in the sense that, that there are certain attitudes that I find useful, that attitude of gratitude I found very, very interesting.
Yes, I found it with food. I just so many memories of my Japanese friends really appreciating just a meal. Like, they would, outside of the expressions that they say before and after eating, they'd really be saying, "Oh, this is so delicious," and they would look so happy, whether it was a bowl of ramen or, just a small piece of cheesecake. They really seemed joyful and happy in that moment and very appreciative of it. Whereas I'd want a second serve of cheesecake or something. So it certainly taught me a lot. These little things and how they come to us and the work that's involved behind the things we have. We never meet all the people involved in the objects that are made for us or in the food that's created for us. But Japanese seem to have an awareness of that more than I certainly do. So it is a powerful learning experience when you live in a country where you see expressions of gratitude daily and they are sincere and honest. We were meant to go back to Japan for a trip this year, and I was so looking forward to it, but obviously we couldn't go. So I do look forward to going back to Japan, as I'm sure you do. Do you have plans to go back anytime soon, assuming the world gets back to some sort of normalness?
Yeah, certainly. I was supposed to be there now So yeah, we'll see when the opportunity arises. I'm keeping an eye out and trying to move things along. But yeah, as you said, it's hard to predict things now.
It is. Now, I usually end my podcast with the question, what is your Ikigai? So if you don't mind sharing, please do.
It's difficult to encapsulate it, but I think the current situation very much brought it to the fore that close relationships, and even not close ones, but kind of valuable, more distant relationships that one has with some acquaintances as well, are such a rich and important part of our lives. So I certainly, I knew that before, but I think it really became more apparent in this current situation that that family, friends, and even acquaintances, so like enduring, valuable social relationships are a very strong part of my life. But also, yes, having other pursuits, and I think research and passion for research and teaching. I have a privilege to have a job that I genuinely enjoy, and I enjoy most aspects of it quite deeply. And yeah, perhaps other kind of creative pursuits. I think the open-ended pursuits that don't necessarily have an output. So if you're creating an artwork, for instance, it's not about knowing so much in my mind what is going to come out, but actually enjoying that process of making it. So I think those three elements, I would say, come together.
Well, it sounds very familiar. I've got a friend who's an old school friend. He's one of the very few old school friends I catch up with, and he lives locally. And he just announced that he's moving to Queensland, and he's got kids and he's busy, and I'm busy. So when we catch up, we really enjoy the time together, even if it's half an hour. So he's leaving like this week, and I can't see him because he's just too busy. We caught up. So yeah, when you realize, wow, I'm not going to be able to catch up. I can't just drive over. You can't drive over. Yeah, it sort of makes you realize, another friend's moved, is moving on, and we'll be able to catch up for sure, but it's just a lot harder to do that. So you do realize, I think you're right, this pandemic and all the restrictions we've had makes you realize it's not material things, it's this intimacy in the relationships, whether it's a good friend or even just an acquaintance. There's some level of intimacy in the conversations you have or the interactions you have. And I really appreciated your research. I wasn't very academic at school, but I'm beginning to enjoy researching and learning, especially when you study one topic in such great detail. It's fascinating, and I have a thirst for learning more, and that's why interviewing people on podcasts is while it's very challenging, I want to be respectful, and I read the work of my guests and spend a lot of time preparing questions. And then afterwards, I have to edit the podcast and transcribe it. It's a lot of work, but I really enjoy it. So thank you for the research you've done for thousands of people who I'm sure have read your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me today. This was really very, very interesting, and yeah, very grateful for having an opportunity to talk to you. Excellent questions. Gave me a lot to think about. But yeah, very, very nice. And that's something we can also be very happy about, that this technology and shared interests can bring us together with other interesting people. I was very glad to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would love to do this again. So I will keep in touch. And I've got so many things to read, but I will get your book, and I am excited about your new book too. So let's keep in touch, and maybe we can discuss that as well in a future episode.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iza.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Ikigai podcast. To download Ikigai worksheets, to take the Ikigai questionnaire, or to join the Ikigai tribe, please visit ikigaitribe.com.